Okay. Alright. I am finally getting around and doing another video. This is December 30th, so New Year's Eve. I haven't been able to get around to doing one of these in a couple of weeks. Just various reasons, holidays and other things going on. It's been difficult. I knew it would be. It's not that so much of a surprise. I've also had to read ahead a little bit in the scriptures themselves, trying to figure out how I want to kind of go forward with this next, because we're reaching that part of the Old Testament now where we're going to be kind of like diverging. We're not going to be reading the book straight in order as we basically have been up until now. We have not done a lot of jumping around in terms of reading one thing and then going off to read something else in a different. We've been pretty much reading them basically in the order in which they're arranged in our copies. But we're not going to be doing that so much anymore. In fact, we're not really going to be doing that very much again. Period. We're kind of past that phase, because now as we get into the Kings, we're going to be having a lot of these like jumps as we go through the narrative, the chronological narrative, the history of Israel. We're going to be going a little bit. We're going to be making some progress and reading the narrative books. Then we're going to be like stopping and taking an offshoot to like one of the prophet books or something like that. So we're going to be doing that basically for the rest of the Old Testament for the most part. Now in this case, we're dealing with the days of King David. Okay, so Saul is gone. We've read through 1 Samuel. We've gotten into the beginning of 2 Samuel, and David is now king. David's career as king is covered in both the book of 2 Samuel and the book of 1 Chronicles. And there is some information that overlaps, and then there is some information that is different. 2 Samuel has some information that 1 Chronicles does not have, and 1 Chronicles has information that 2 Samuel does not have. There is some information that overlaps. So we're going to be kind of jumping back and forth between 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles a lot as we go through the rest of the kingship of David. So in order to help set this up, I need to explain kind of the difference between Samuel and Chronicles. I did not read the first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles, which are all genealogies. I do intend to get back to that at some point, just to read it, just to include it, just to be comprehensive. It is probably the single most difficult section of scriptures to get through today, for us today. Those first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles are tough. I mean, we got through those tabernacle sections in the second half of Exodus, about the instructions of how to build a tabernacle and all that. And that was dry. Okay, that was tough. We got through the law, we got through Leviticus. Some of that was pretty dry. But man, those genealogies in 1 Chronicles, that's tough. Okay? Take it from someone who has read the Bible out loud several times. Though it is tough getting past those genealogies at the beginning of 1 Chronicles. So I haven't read it. We kind of skipped that. I think I'll go back and read it at some point, possibly when I, get through the time of David into Solomon, and we really start focusing on the split kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Because after the days of David's son Solomon, the kingdom is going to split, and they're going to have 2 different monarchies, and so about that. But so we might cover that later. But the point of Chronicles, Chronicles is like Samuel and Kings in that it was originally one book. We divided it into 1st and 2nd Chronicles. 1st Chronicles is basically about David. The 2nd Chronicles is about all the kings that came after David. Excuse me. And Chronicles. Okay, that's wrong. I need both of them. Chronicles was written after. Okay, so Samuel and Kings are history books, and Chronicles is too. But Samuel and Kings are more concerned with recording the deeds of the kings, good or bad. And in particular, honestly, it focuses on the bad, so largely Kings in particular. When we get to Kings in particular will focus a lot on the bad. Even you even see that in Samuel, because as we go through 1 Samuel, we document the failures of Eli, the priest at the time. We document the failures of Saul. 2 Samuel will document the failures of David. And Kings, the books of Kings, will document the failures of the kings to a significant degree. And those books, Kings, Samuel Kings, were written to record how and why Israel eventually fell as a kingdom. I mentioned earlier that after the days of David's son Solomon, the kingdom is united under David. David unites the kingdom. We pretty much read that last time as he finally consolidates his power in both the southern area of Judah and Simeon, and then the northern area with the rest of the tribes, and then even across the Jordan with the tribes that settled east of the Jordan. And David finally kind of unites the kingdom and makes it, they go from a tribal confederacy with a lot of their own inter-tribal rivalries to a united kingdom. That only lasts about 80 years, not even that really. That only lasts about 60 or 70 years. It lasts through the time of David and David's son Solomon, and when Solomon dies, the kingdom splits again. They're never united again. And then eventually, over the course of time, both of those kingdoms that split, the northern kingdom, which is called Israel, the southern kingdom, which is called Judah, both of them eventually get conquered by foreign enemies and taken away into captivity, which is very common. That's the ultimate fate of many ancient nations in the world. The northern kingdom of Israel falls to Assyria in 722 BC, and the southern kingdom of Judah, which is where the temple is, falls to Babylon in 586 BC, about 140 or so years later, and that is the end of the independent kingdom of Israel or Judah. And so the books of Samuel and Kings are written to document that. They're written to document that history of how Israel goes from a loosely organized tribal confederacy ruled by these regional judges to a united kingdom under a monarch, to a divided kingdom under two monarchs, to a fallen kingdom, to two separate fallen kingdoms that have each gone into captivity and fallen at the hands of their enemies. And these ultimately, and the development that is being tracked in these books ultimately is to show that this happened because of the failure of the kings and the priests, but the failure of the kings to provide good leadership for the people, and the failure of the priests to do their job in teaching and ministering to the people. So that's the purpose of the books of Samuel and King, which is why there's a lot of emphasis on their failures, because the whole point of the books is to show why the kingdom failed. That's what we've been reading for the most part up until now. Chronicles is different. Chronicles was written later, okay? There comes a point in time after the temple was destroyed by Babylon in 586 BC. About 50 years later, 60 years later, they are allowed to go back to their land by another king. Babylon itself falls at the hands of the Persians. The Medo-Persian Empire comes and takes over Babylon. And the ruler of the Persian Empire, a guy named Cyrus, allows the people, the captured people that he inherited from Babylon, he allows them, including the Jews, to go back to their own lands and resume their old customs and worship services, as long as they pay tribute to him. He's not doing this just for the sake of the Jews, the old Judahites that used to live in Judah and worship at the temple, who are now in Babylon. He is not doing that. Isaiah, the Bible will say that Cyrus is doing this because God will put the thought in his mind. Cyrus doesn't think that. He's doing it because he thinks this is good policy. By the time Cyrus comes along in the second half of the 500s BC, there's been enough conquest and takeover of empires at this point that he realizes that when you capture people and take them away, that just creates hostility. Eventually they or their sons are going to rise up and fight against you. So So to kind of prevent that, to soothe people, to have a more willing subject population, he gives them a lot of their freedom back, but they have to pay tribute to him. So he takes all the captives he inherited from Babylon and lets them go back to their lands and build their temples and worship their gods again. And he's fine with that as long as they pay tribute to him. They're not independent. They're not the masters of their own destiny. But at least they get to go back to their land and worship and build their own temple and worship their own God, which is what the later books of the Old Testament are about. And that's in the late 500s BC into the 400s BC. Which is as far as the Old Testament narrative goes, until about the mid 400s BC. The person who wrote Chronicles would have lived around that time period in the very closing days of the Old Testament. In fact, Chronicles may have been, if not the last book written in the Old Testament, just about the last book in the Old Testament. Chronicles itself goes together with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah are the last books chronologically in the Old Testament, and they went together. They originally were a unit. Ezra and Nehemiah was originally one book, and they go together with Chronicles. And they probably were all written by the same guy. We don't know for certain, but probably the same guy who wrote Ezra and Nehemiah, who probably was Ezra, was also probably the guy who wrote the Chronicles. We call him the Chronicler. We don't know this for certain, but probably was all the same guy. Unlike the books of Kings and Samuel, which are clearly compiled from different writers and prophets and court historians that kept records, Chronicles is all written. Now, this guy who wrote the Chronicles has access to some of these materials, but it was all that the Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah were all written by one guy. And that person, Ezra, whoever he may have been, it was a priest, very clearly, obviously a priest, and had a very strong focus. He wasn't just restating the history that was already written in Samuel and Kings. He knew about that history. First Chronicles knows about Samuel and Kings. Okay, it's like the guy who wrote First Chronicles knows about those books, those earlier works of Samuel. He also knows about other things that we don't have anymore. But he knows, whoever the chronicler was, he knows about Samuel and Kings. He also knows about other information that Samuel and Kings didn't have, and that he had access to information that we don't have access to today. And he has a different purpose than the writers of Samuel and Kings. He is not writing Chronicles just to document Israel's failures. He is writing Chronicles to a people who are back in the land trying to regather themselves after exile, after captivity, and coming back, getting a second chance to come back and live in the land again, which is unprecedented. I mean, that would not have been something that would have happened to people in ancient history up to that point in time. When your kingdom fell, So they're back. They're in the land again. They have a second shot at this. God is giving them another shot at being his people, being his kingdom. And so the chronicler is writing their history again, this time with an emphasis on showing that they in their day and time, in the 400s BC or whatever, still have continuity with the promises of God that he made to David and to the people of the past, before the temple fell. Okay, so those promises that God speaks to David are not gone. He has not finished his work with, even though there is no king of Israel any longer, the kingship has fallen. David, the promises God made to David are still valid, and he is still going to fulfill them. The temple system that they're building today is still valid. It still has a connection with the temple system that they had back in the day before it fell. Okay, you've got to just focus on, recommitting to the proper principles of God, follow the priesthood, get those priests back in order, so they can teach the people properly, and we can do it right again this time. So that's what Chronicles is written for. Chronicles is not written just to document their failures and explain why they went into captivity, like Samuel and Kings are. Chronicles is written to show how, despite that, their history is still unbroken with the past. Their covenants that God made with them are still active and valid, and they can still be his people, and he will still be their God. So Chronicles is a different set of stories in it. Some of the stories overlap or are the same. but some of them are different. Chronicles and information in it that Samuel and Kings don't have, and vice versa. So when I go back and forth between David, between Samuel, as we read through the rest of the lifetime of David, and I go back and forth between Samuel and Chronicles, and then later we go back and forth between Kings and Chronicles. You have to remember that Chronicles was written later. Samuel Kings was written first. It was compiled. It's made out of documents that were compiled even at the time, and then someone else, some prophet or whatever, came along and compiled those into historical documents. And it's impossible to say how many additions or revisions or versions of those books there were, because they were whoever put these books together in their final form was relying on official court documents and information that have long since been lost, and it's impossible to say just how many editors' hands this stuff passed through before it reached the version that we have now. Chronicles came along later, came along after the exile, and it was probably written by one guy who was writing Israel's history with a focus on assuring the people of his day that they still had a connection to the promises and history of the past before the exile. So Chronicles comes later, and it's written for a different focus, and I'll be highlighting some of those differences. So some of the differences in focus come out in the way, even when the material is the same, even when the chronicler is giving the same information that the writer of Samuel or Kings does, sometimes he writes it a little differently, which highlights his different focus. Okay, so we're going to be going back and forth a lot between 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles as we go through the rest of the story of David. And as we go through the rest of the story of the Kings, we're going to be doing the same. And that's pretty much how we're going to be reading this from now on. As we read through these books, these historical documents, we're going to be going back and forth between the historical books and getting all the information we can. And then after David, we're also going to be eventually getting into the prophets. So when we come along with our prophet, when we reach the point in time where one of the prophets would have come along, we're going to be jumping off and reading one of the prophetic books also. But that's going to be a little ways. We're not going to be reading the Psalms. David is titled, David's name is part of the title of many of the Psalms. And as we read through the account of David in 1 Chronicles, we're going to be reading a lot. Oh my goodness, my hair. What is that? We're going to be reading a lot about the effort David went through to set up the worship system into a temple. He didn't get to build a temple himself, but he made a lot of preparations for it, and he designed the worship system that they are going to use there, which include a lot of music. So I was thinking about, after getting through David's time, going on doing the Psalms, but we're not going to be doing that. We're going to be saving the Psalms for last, actually. That's the last thing we'll be doing in the Old Testament. But when we get through Solomon, for example, we are going to be reading Proverbs and Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes. And then we get down to, in the rest of the king time, we're going to be reading, when we get to the days of Isaiah, Hezekiah and Isaiah, we're going to be reading Isaiah. So we're going to be doing a lot of this kind of, it's going to be like a tree with branches that we're going to be reading, kind of these offshoots as we go. We're not going to be reading straight in a line the way we have been before, basically. Okay, that's enough for this one. I'll be starting a new video.